I thought we'd start off with the experience that Liz and I had last Tuesday. We went down to the Center for Constitutional Rights, and they were giving a seminar for various donors. And Gita, along with her presentation, talked about the fact that we have to now recognize that what we thought was a temporary condition has become permanent. And by that she meant not only the fact that Guantánamo is opening, but all of the legislation that has been passed, the anti-Muslim terrorism, that is a permanent part of our world now. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. Is that too bleak a way of looking at the world, or do you think that's what our reality really is?
I think one has to look at history over a longer span. I think there are, probably from the late 19th century, there have been particular tensions. In fact, ironically, by the middle of the 19th century, the use of torture had been abolished in Western countries. Previously, it had been permitted to be applied, a judicial device, legally permissible to obtain the truth, so-called, and it had been discontinued. But by the end of the 19th century, there was a growth of state agencies, espionage, police, military intelligence, that came into being as arms of the state, that claimed that they should not be bound by the restrictions of customary legislation. And there was simultaneously a long-running legal concept for many centuries of what you could call the exceptional crime. And to my mind, the history of the 20th century and the history of the first 10 years of this century is a constant tension amongst states, many states, of those principles that there are offences or crimes that should never be committed. The use of torture, extrajudicial killing, destruction of human rights. These are impermissible and states know it. But in tension with that is the concept that there are some emergencies and there are some arms of the state who are justified in destroying those rights. And so I think one has to look at the march of history to see how those tensions play out. And I don't think one can just say in the last 10 years something new has happened. I don't agree with that. I think if you look over a longer span, if you look post-World War II at the international resolutions that we should never do this again, that states should police each other, and all of the heroic international treaties to ensure that we should never do it, UN Declaration of Human Rights, European Convention on Human Rights. If you consider those, and then you consider that within a handful of years, the French were torturing Algerians. In fact, Jean-Paul Sartre said, how can it be that when the screams from the torture chambers of the Gestapo have barely subsided, that we, the French, are doing this to others horrifically? And we, the British, were doing this to the Mau Mau in the 1950s. And so, you know, we do well to revisit and sharpen our knowledge of history, to understand that there is never a pure victory over abuse of human rights. There never is. It's never static. there's always the ability to resort, for claimed reasons of pragmatism, to the forbidden. And that's what we in Britain have done, and that's what America has done during the last 10 years. But we did it before, and we did it ourselves in Britain throughout the conflict in Northern Ireland, shamefully. And it's what we did that fueled the fires of that conflict, where a state perpetrates injustice and where the state gives no remedy against that perpetration, then that fuels reaction and violent reaction.
As I listen to there are two sets of conditions going on. One are the circumstances, the claiming of special circumstances, and the other are the agencies, certain agencies, etc. But we seem to be living in a time when people are proclaiming that the circumstance is not temporary or permanent, that we will live in a permanent condition of warfare on terror. The whole idea of the war on terror is just so open-ended and so permanent. And we live in at least in the States, I feel this all the time, we live in a situation in which the replication of agencies of the state, with the passage of the Homeland Defense Act, the creation of new agencies and new powers for new agencies, it's kind of like it's ceaseless. Or is that just too depressing?
No, of course, there's an endless appetite for expansion of state powers, and that is nothing new. If you revisit the correspondence between Madison and Jefferson, when the tyrant had been overthrown, their whole discussion of what was needed, whether it was needed to have a Bill of Rights, the whole discussion was considering how to legislate against themselves for the future, because there will always be a temptation to do that. And in fact, what we have now is a paradox in many ways. We have, certainly our country and America, have situations of enormous state power and strength and stability, and resources to coerce or suppress, or our respective states are internally and externally strong. And yet at the same time, you have an extraordinarily developed neurosis to suggest that the state is somehow suddenly acutely vulnerable. And it's, to my mind, a misconception. Perhaps we have some ability to see it in more than one way, because we have been through 25 years of armed conflict in relation to the affairs of the north of Ireland. And so we have had that experience of bombs going off in London frequently, massive attacks upon the cities in which we live in England, and our neighbours in the north of Ireland have lived through a war that lived in a war zone. And yet here we are. And if one has had the chance of looking at the narrative of how we came out of that period of intense conflict, one can see the history of state action and reaction. The IRA could not recruit until Bloody Sunday, after the British Army had shot dead 13 innocent civilians protesting peacefully for their rights, civil rights. There was no shortage of volunteers for the IRA, and every state injustice brought about a reaction. And at the end, the IRA had to be talked to. They had to be. And one of the recurrent daily observations we have of the claimed never-ending war on terror is the utter failure to learn from history and to have some kind of sane analysis of whether perceived enemies are enemies. And we see, Egypt, we supported Mubarak and his torturing regime for 20, 30 years. Tunisia, Syria, all of these in the past months, 2 months, we have come to see those we called terrorists were dissenters. In England we had many Libyan dissidents whose focus of political activity until they fled and gained refuge here, focus of activity was simply removing Gaddafi. But we called them terrorists here. We subjected them to internment without trial, attempts to deport them to a country where we knew they would be tortured. We arrived at diplomatic accommodations with Gaddafi, and we claimed that they would be safe if they were deported there because there was a Gaddafi Foundation headed by Saif Gaddafi, his son. It's laughable. It's insane. But we pursue our perceived economic, strategic objectives to the exclusion of a sane approach to justice. We simply do, and we don't learn from our history. Very recently, in the High Court in London, there were a number of elderly men and women who had been members of the Mau Mau in Kenya 50 years ago. And they were bringing an action against the British government, for the men had been castrated, the women had been raped, there had been unspeakable tortures committed by the British Army, and Foreign Office documents had surfaced at the time they brought their action, which demonstrated it wasn't rogue soldiers, it was systemic, it was ordered from the top. And so the very shallow labelling and the shallow use of concepts of who is the enemy, who is not the enemy, has to be revisited. It is not, well, it is possible, sadly, to continue war forever, but it isn't sane, and in the process we destroy the very few things that we say we hold sacred, those difficult rights of due process, procedural rights, difficult to fight for if they apply to the outlaws or outcasts of society. Nobody considers they deserve them. But we need to bring ourselves up short. We have had the opportunity in this country. We have a new government a year ago, coalition government, and because so many truly terrible things happened under the Labour government, in which there was a conscious destruction, again from the top, just like the Mau Mau. Complicity in torture, complicity in rendition. The new government announced that it wanted to draw a line under the past, and it ordered a public inquiry into our complicity in torture, and the men who had come back from Guantánamo, the British citizens and the British residents, 15 of them, had been for 2 years suing the government for conspiracy to torture and kidnap. And the new coalition government said that it wished to negotiate and settle those claims. But in the course of the civil litigation, you get disclosure, grudging disclosure. We sued MI5, MI6, Foreign Office, Home Office, the Attorney General. And before the final negotiation, we had begun to get disclosure of some of the internal documents. And they were profoundly disturbing. The government had said publicly, we're doing everything we can to get these men back from Guantánamo. We deplore Guantánamo. But if you look at the early email interdepartmental traffic, there's the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister saying explicitly, send them to Guantánamo, send them there. We don't want them back in England. This is British citizens, knowing it was from one unlawful black hole in Bagram to another in Guantánamo, saying the longer they stay there, the better, saying this one in Zambia could be saved if we have consular access. An email back saying this is from number 10, do not give him consular access. So it's a shameful story.
You know, I've read a couple of articles where you make that connection between the campaign, the terrorism against the IRA and Guantánamo and the Muslims today. And I was trying to think of, there's a kind of segue from one to the other in the writing in England. I was trying to think of what is comparable in the United States, you know, that this does not come just with Guantánamo, that there has to be a history. After 9/11, they were so prepared instantly to enact the legislation they had it prepared. It was kind of a similar situation in the sense of this feeling that the state apparatus must engage in terror in order to survive. Do you compare the English and the American situations at all?
I think the Americans were more overt about what they did. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld. They said what they were doing. Torture is internationally prohibited. There is no defense. If you are involved in torture, there's no defense of superior orders or necessity. And so what the Americans did was redefine some of the mechanics of torture in order to give immunity to those who were carrying it out. So waterboarding was defined as not torture. But the British were complicit, but not overt in what they did. But yet they knew, and they should have known. They should have recognized prohibited techniques. If you if you talk to men who were held in Bagram in January 2002, they were in a vast disused air hangar in the freezing cold of an Afghan winter, and they were in thin clothes, sitting on concrete floors in stress positions, made to sit in a static position hour after hour with just razor wire around them, not allowed to talk at all to each other. And the interrogation rooms were overlooking these cages of razor wire, and you could hear, everyone could hear the screams and the noise from there. And there were rooms on the ground floor where if the door opened you could see men hanging by their wrists. And if you talk to those British citizens or British residents who were held at that time there, you ask them, were there British agents there? And they say you could see them walking 2 by 2 along the razor wire. And they could see everything. They could hear everything. So we know that a message came back to their superiors saying, we are seeing things. Is this permissible? And the advice, the legal advice came back, provided you're not the ones doing it, literally, physically doing it. It's fine, carry on. So here's the information to give to the interrogators. Let us have the product back. And that's complicity in torture. That's just as prohibited as being the ones who do the physical damage. And that's what we've done. And that's what we're still doing. We have close relationships with countries that torture. We send them information. We get information back for what it's worth from the torture chambers. And there's been a pitched battle in this country over many years to expose that and prevent the use of it. There's been a pitched battle going on, and yet we should know, since Ireland took the United Kingdom to the European Court of Human Rights in the 70s for using precisely those techniques, stress positions, hooding, use of extreme cold, use of extreme noise. That's what we did, and it's prohibited, and we know it. But the methodology for eradicating torture, the accepted methodology is two-stranded. One is to get the data. You have to know exactly who did what, to whom and when. You need clear, verifiable detail. You need doctors to check, to prove. You need corroborating evidence. You need to know. And the second strand is to ensure that those on whose watch it happened are brought to book. And we have a problem, in Britain in particular, because although we say we've forsworn a number of things, we haven't forsworn secrecy. And that's one of our particular national vices, that if the state claims that it's in the interests of national security not to reveal something, that trumps everything here. And so although the government has ordered an inquiry into our complicity in torture, particularly in relation to the Guantánamo former detainees, it's going to be in secret. And those who were involved or responsible will give their evidence in secret. And so it's a fallacy that is capable of acting as a corrective. It's a total fallacy.
We have the same problem.
Not quite the same, I think. I think America has a greater degree, considerably greater degree of openness. I mean, the whistleblowers are a protected species in the United States. They're certainly not here. And you know, Senate hearings, congressional hearings have a much greater practical experience of pressing for detail in a public forum.
It's possible, but the will doesn't seem to be there.
Okay.
In the Congress, that would be the difference.
Yes.
The Congress seems to be willing just to go along with the president on all of this.
I think there are particular moments when there is a crisis of embarrassment or exposure, and it's those moments which taken at the flood. And certainly Abu Ghraib was one. There were pictures, and that made an enormous difference. And quite similar circumstances here. Some of the British forces in Iraq have been responsible for brutal killings and the use of torture. And ironically, because there have been court-martials or inquests, ironically, the military have been exposed to a far greater degree in terms of investigation, findings, recommendations, prosecutions, a far greater degree than the intelligence services or the relevant ministries. But I think the lesson we learn is that if you look at the Mau Mau and you realise that it was all there, that it was from the top, it was systemic, it involved those on the ground who carried out unspeakable acts. Had any of those, had it been in the public domain, and had everyone concerned been prosecuted, sentenced maybe to life, including ministers who authorised it, senior military officers, civil servants, if that had happened, you would, I think, never have had the same happening again in the north of Ireland. You would never have had complicity in Guantánamo, complicity in Bagram. You would never have it because they would know the consequences.
one of the reasons why we're undertaking this project is to document the full range of the history of Guantanamo. And part of that is the documentation of the torture of the detainees,
Yes.
which is difficult to do in an American situation because none of the detainees will ever be allowed into the United States. So
Yes.
here, I was wondering if you could tell, we were talking off tape about when the chap from Tipton came home. I was wondering if you could tell that story for us as a way of further documenting that.
Shafiq Rasool was the older one of the three, and then two young ones, Ruhul Ahmed and Asif Iqbal. They're all very young. And when they came back, they were arrested and detained as sheer tokenism, to show that there was some kind of investigation going on into their supposed involvement in terrorism. Everybody knew that was nonsense, but so for one night they were in Paddington Green police station. And it was dangerous for them to go back to the West Midlands where they lived. Whilst they had been in Guantanamo, there had been very active racist interest in where they lived. There had been effigies hung on lampposts outside their houses. And the police, in fact, suggested they should not go home, or not for a while. And they stayed for a while in the house I live in. And so in the most fortunate circumstance, in order just to be able to talk to survivors from the most terrible ordeal, they had come back from hell. There were three very young men sitting around the kitchen table, and simultaneously talking about some of the horrors, and there were too many to tell, and looking at their new mobile telephones and flicking them on and off, but without proper knowledge and, in hindsight, with regret, without comprehending how difficult it was for the victim of trauma to revisit that trauma. We made them sit down on and off for about a month and tell, because they were the first to come out, the only ones who knew, only ones who had any idea of explaining what had happened, which was extraordinary to hear that this had been done by human beings to other human beings, and by Americans. It was the time of Abu Ghraib, in fact. It was exactly that time. And there were those photographs, which were too shocking to ignore. But there were no photographs of Guantanamo, and there never have been, and there probably never will be, of the torture. Okay, pictures of men in orange suits in humiliating positions when they get off the plane, when they're first taken there. That's the triumphalist picture of their captor, but there was nothing to show what had been done to them. And so they showed someone who just spent time looking at the different horrible positions they contorted themselves into. Someone spent time sketching those, and that was the next best thing to photographs with their account. But they had been in Guantánamo for nearly 3 years, and they were very young. 2 of them had been teenagers, and they came out with that strength and resilience of youth, and they had each other, and that was important. But in the years since, I think in our profound ignorance, we've come to understand much more of the kind of irreparable damage the use of torture inflicts upon a human being. They're all they're lovely young men, and they're very good. They've all found employment, they've trained in a skill, they're all married, they have children, they're living good lives, as are all of the men who've come back from Guantánamo, all of them. But if you talk just a little bit and they're willing to tell you, they're all haunted. They wake up in the night, they can't live comfortably with their families in contained premises. They need space and isolation. They have flashbacks all the time of the torture. And that can't be removed, that's there. And physically, you know, they have terrible pain, their backs have gone. It's quite extraordinary what man does to man. And they knew from the beginning that these 3 young men were nothing. They knew that. But yet they chained them, held them hour after hour after hour in freezing cold in Guantánamo, until they all confessed that yes, it was them in a video with Osama bin Laden. They confessed to it. But it turned out, because there was a date on the video, it's possible to establish they'd all been working in an electronic shop in Tipton at that very time. So the concept that torture produces the truth is insanity. It's complete insanity. And that, you know, sanity was arrived at by the mid-19th century on that issue, that torture didn't produce truth and that its use degraded society. And yet, here we are again, with this deranged concept that the end justifies the means, and the means are useful, let alone okay.
There's one British resident left.
Shaka Ama.
why is he still there when all the others have been?
We don't completely know. He's never been charged with something. The Americans have never framed a charge on any evidence, but yet it appears that they have in their minds that he is somehow dangerous because, it seems, simply because he has an extremely charismatic presence, a powerful personality, which in Guantánamo has had effect on other prisoners in terms of discussion of complaining, resisting. But that appears to be it. But at the same time, the British have been appallingly weak or worse. And with Shaka, several years ago, the time Binyam Mohammed came back, the Foreign Office wrote to Shaka's wife and said, "We're closing the file, we're not going to do any more for him." He has a British wife, British children here. And it was only at the time of the negotiation of the legal action of the other Guantánamo men who've been returned that the government here woke up to what was a catastrophe, because as they sat down to negotiate, every man said, "I don't want money, I want Shaka back." All of them. They had a private meeting with a very senior minister, and what one could see was that the minister must have asked the senior civil servants and said, "Well, why isn't he back? What's going on?" And they had to confess that actually they'd done nothing to get him back. So now there's a supposed energized attempt, and recently, a few days ago, President Obama was here and Hillary Clinton, and Shaka Amar was the subject of meetings. But we have had such deceit over so many years. We really believe very little. We were told for so many years, we're trying to get them back, we're trying to persuade the Americans. And then years later we see these emails saying, the longer they stay there, the better. It leads to a very bleak cynicism. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the European Court. You know, I've been interviewing some of the lawyers today. Feel very frustrated because the American Supreme Court has ineffectively closed down. With the last weaker case, they've closed down. The D.C. District Court has closed down. Mm-hmm. But is the European Court a court of resort for you here?
There are some cases before the European Court at the moment that have a resonance, and those are a number of men in different cases where America is seeking their extradition. They're British, and America has extended its jurisdictional appetite to say that they've committed offences triable in America. And there are two issues in which the court has asked for more evidence, more submissions, more questions. One is the imposition of life without parole, and the other is use of extreme solitary confinement in supermax prisons. And it's accepted that each of these men might face both of those prospects. And so the European Court has asked the question, does the Eighth Amendment of the US Constitution provide equivalent protection to Article 3 of the European Convention, which prohibits torture and cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment? And the answer is, curiously, we say no, because we have a love and respect for the American Constitution. And it has been surprising and shocking to us that case law on the Eighth Amendment in terms of particular solitary confinement, the case law in America says the Eighth Amendment entitles the prisoner to shelter and warmth and food, but human association is not a human right. Whereas all of the expert evidence and research shows overwhelmingly that to confine someone for an extended period of time, or even not an extended period of time, can produce madness, can produce psychosis, at the very minimum produces acute psychological and psychiatric effects. But America makes use of extreme isolation for tens of thousands of prisoners. Tens of thousands of prisoners.
Those pictures of Pelican Bay are just incredible.
We have been shocked to appreciate, as a result of litigating these cases, the extent to which prisons have been purpose-built, designed by architects to sensorily deprive human beings, and men confined in a tiny steel cell, not just for a week or a month, but year after year after year, and potentially for life. No human mind could survive that. If the European Court finds, and it hasn't yet arrived at a decision, if it finds that such conditions, including life without any hope of parole, would violate Article 3, it will refuse the UK permission to extradite to America. And I don't know if that would have any impact at all. But a previous case, the case of Söring, was a man extradited, to be extradited from here to the US, who faced the death penalty. And the European Court prohibited extradition to a form of imprisonment which would involve what's described as the death row syndrome. And so no European country now, no country is allowed to extradite to another country anywhere in the world if there is the potential of the death penalty. And so what America has done since the case of Söring has given assurances, written government assurances, to say that the death penalty would not be sought. So there is that limited indirect potential of affecting in a minor way how America might look at what it does.
In the States, there was a moment of euphoria or a moment of optimism when Obama was elected. Was that replicated here at all?
Oh, yes, absolutely. One of the most extraordinary not just images but experiences was to see President Obama inaugurated. It was a resolution, it seemed, of the terrible, terrible history of slavery and the experiences of those who fought for civil rights, the voter registration movement. That day when Obama was inaugurated was the most extraordinary day, and we felt it here, and there is no taking away from that. It was, and it remains, something utterly magnificent in our history. What is happening now is progression. Any politician coming to power finds his or her way in governing, and that is difficult. But the expectations that were placed upon Obama and the gulf between those and the delivery has been substantial. And he's a consensus politician, and he's up against considerable movement within the Republican Party to row back on issues like trial by military commission. In fact, I think 2 days ago, Congress passed legislation saying that no foreign terrorist could be prosecuted before a jury, which makes us wonder about these extradition cases, because some years ago America had to give a diplomatic assurance in these cases that they would not be made enemy combatants, that they would stand trial before a jury. But now Congress has brought this in. So the ability to maintain good intentions is supremely difficult. And Obama's a law professor, then he should know better than some of the decisions he's made.
In looking at the history of this, I'm kind of impressed with the fact that in the UK you've been able to mount a public campaign for the release, parliamentarians, political people who are active in the political world, where that seems to be impossible in the United States.
A campaign on what?
To pressure the government in order to pressure the United States to release the prisoners.
From Guantánamo.
There were amicus briefs with parliamentarians.
Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived.
Oh.
That was not necessarily.
It was a good press.
A clear-cut course. I promise you, it wasn't. But there were certain key triggers that brought things much more to a head. And one was in 2003, there was an announcement by the Americans that they were building a death chamber in Guantánamo, and that two of, I think it was 4 or 6, the first men to be placed before a military commission on trial would include 2 British men, Firoz Abbasi and Moazzam Begg. And that just hit, in particular the Daily Mail, as a conservative, patriotic newspaper. But the thought that British men were going to be executed by the Americans was a step too far. And across the board, there was a reaction, and it had multiple ingredients of campaigners, and legal initiatives were tried one way and another, including Shafiq Rasul from Tipton. By an accident of fate, his brother had asked for legal representation here, saying, is there anything you could do? At the same time that lawyers in America were looking for an identified individual in Guantánamo because identities were not known. And as I remember, there had been a class action initiated in California almost immediately by the ACLU, I think, which didn't get off the ground because they didn't have a name. But here was Shafiq Rasul, and so there were lawyers there looking, and here's Mr. Rasul, and here are faxes, affidavits, get habeas started.
Were you involved in getting that name to the CCR?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. It was a very happy encounter indeed, yes. And so, there have been different ways in which issues had been progressed. One significant player in the campaigning was Moazzam Begg's father, who had been a banker, and he was a very composed, very dignified, quite traditional person, and he spoke here, there, everywhere, and he was impressive to people. He carried with him an authentic credibility, and so it came about through a range of pressures that it became profoundly uncomfortable for the then government to continue to do nothing. And so suddenly you had the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, tearing back and forth across the Atlantic. And when you come later on to see some of the email traffic, you see the hypocrisy. At the same time, Telex is going saying, we're okay with military commissions from this end. At the same time, trumpeting, we're doing everything we can to get Moazzam Begg back. But they had to start doing something. It was more embarrassing not to do something than to do something. That's the point you've got to get to. That's the point.
When you were talking about, Obama and the culmination of the civil rights movement, it had slipped my mind that you had been in the United States with Martin Luther King at a point in time. So that has a certain poignancy for you?
For the 10 years between 1960 and 1970, like the whole of the rest of the world, one watched with or the courage of those in the civil rights movement who risked all to achieve what they achieved. And that's the reason, isn't it, why when Obama was inaugurated, that enveloped all of that history in just one
Well, what did you
message.
do when you were in the States?
Is this personal?
Okay, but you've been twice, at least that I know. Another was testimony for the Lantos Committee on Ireland.
Okay.
You did testify before the Congressional Committee, Congressman Lantos?
I've certainly testified, I think, for 2 congressional committees, one on the Birmingham Six, who were wrongly convicted, and maybe I haven't, I'm not sure. I certainly went to Washington in relation to a number of cases of wrongly convicted men here, and got sympathy, encouragement.
When you talk about getting the facts, the verifiable facts,
Yeah.
How are we to do that?
It's very easy if there's a will. For instance, in Greece, after the fall of the military junta, the new Greek government ordered an exhaustive inquiry into those who have been the victims of torture by the junta. And the report, the findings that they made were extraordinarily detailed and important, an object lesson in how to do it. As long as those people or those interests remain in power that have had a hand in it, it is deliberately made almost impossible or very difficult. But if you take the models of post-revolutionary society, or dramatic, deliberate change in society, then of course there's the potential. And post-apartheid South Africa set up the model of truth, the truth commissions. And so the concept of truth and reconciliation comes with the message you can't have reconciliation without knowing the truth. And there is a constant theme in the north of Ireland to get to grips with the secrets of the past, and the Savile inquiry took an enormous amount of time to investigate Bloody Sunday. I think at the end, ironically, they chickened out of showing that it did indeed go to the top. But it was important, of huge importance to the families, to have the innocence of their family members who'd been murdered recognised, and to have it acknowledged that it was murder by the state that was important.
It would be kind of easy to see Guantanamo as an American problem. How do you see it as a British problem or international problem?
I think it's the most overt example of something that goes on in a covert way all the time. There's country after country after country that detains people unlawfully without due process, with the complicity of other countries. And this is just on a very big scale and too big to be kept secret. But almost every country visited Guantanamo for its own purposes, if it had a national there or someone in whom was interested. Almost every country went there, fed in information, derived what it could out of Guantanamo. So it was a joint venture, to be honest.
When we were talking, there were two aspects. One to working on a kind of problematic, my words are problematic. One was gaining verifiable information. The other was a sense of justice. What would justice look like for the perpetrators of Guantanamo and those who allowed them to go in?
You mean, can anyone be brought to justice?
Yes.
Satisfactorily?
Would it be personal justice? Would it be some institutional justice? What would justice look like?
Well, at the moment there is a police investigation continuing into the potential complicity of particular MI5, MI6 officers in relation to US detentions of individuals at those early stages in 2002. And in a way, whether or not those individuals were prosecuted is not what interests most people, and particularly those most affected, the victims. If there is evidence of a much bigger picture, then it's that bigger picture that needs to be seen. I do believe that, I mean, for instance, there is the War Crimes Tribunal, which has, from time to time, prosecutions of individuals who have had senior roles in particular sustained atrocities. There are many senior people, politicians or civil servants, who could, on the basis of the law and facts that we are aware of already, be prosecuted. And my view is, although I have no particular interest in one individual or another being in the dock, it's not a personal or vindictive approach. My view is that unless you do prosecute, these practices will simply go on and on and on and on. And so in another 10 years, another 20 years, it will go on again. And the only way to bring a halt to it is to expose what's being done and to bring those to book who did it.
It's similar to the earlier discussion of the failure to do something like that with Northern Ireland, with the IRA, the failure to prosecute the perpetrators. Your earlier, if we had,
Yes.
you know.
Yes, and instead, for instance, with Bloody Sunday, instead of court-martialing soldiers who had shot unarmed civilians, we not only condoned it, but the Lord Chief Justice Widgery was brought in to conduct a review, and he produced an utterly mendacious whitewash. And that was causative of reaction of a most profound kind. And so it's the distorting of processes and the distorting and contamination of the law to twist it around and use it in an abusive way that is profoundly corrosive of society. And so that imperative to have honesty, and as a result of honesty, consequences, appropriate consequences, it remains critically important. But in Britain, will we ever achieve it? Not as long as we are so devoted to the concept of secrecy.
The last question is, where do you think we're going to go? What does tomorrow hold?
I think the lesson to learn is that there is no pinnacle of enlightened achievement that simply sustains itself. There isn't a sunny plateau that you remain on. That the tensions we've discussed that lead states constantly to look for or to adopt procedures outside of legal convention, and the recognition that nevertheless there are legal conventions they have to be adhered to. That constant battle, I think, is there forever, and therefore one has to be alert and on the watch and keeping guard and fighting for it, and that means the whole of society, and that's difficult. It isn't what interests most people, it isn't what affects most people's lives, but nevertheless it's poisonous when it infects, and ultimately it doesn't do any good. It doesn't make society safe, it makes it less safe, and it reproduces itself open-endedly. Learning history, being aware of our history, all of us, doesn't hurt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.